We are now at part 3, page 257, chapter 8, joints, and we're coming to some more conventions here. Let's consider our model in this particular case is moving from anatomical position, which is the arm at the side, and then we're going to be moving that arm forward in this direction. And so what you'll see here is that it's somewhat conventional that we would call this a flexion. She could just as easily move that same joint dorsally, and we would be getting two bones not really moving any closer together. Normally we think of a flexion as a moving together of bones, like at the elbow. But in this case, we're just going to use the convention that if we move the shoulder in this forward direction, then we're going to call it flexion. And if we move the shoulder in a backward direction, we're going to call that extension. And again, I'm going to avoid the use of the term hyperextension in this course. Okay, so that's the movement of convention there. Here we actually do have bones coming closer together, and we have at the knee a flexion. And usually that does involve bones coming closer together, flexing. And then if we cause the bones to move further apart, we're going to call that extension. Okay? So oftentimes when we're walking or running, we have to flex to bring the foot around again. In the case of kicking a ball, then we're going to be extending. That sort of thing is going to be conventional. Okay? Then we come down to something further now. Here we have something called abduction and adduction. And sometimes I use the manner of speaking abduction and adduction because the two words sound very much alike. Here we are in anatomical position, right? She's facing us. She's standing erect, and her arm is at the side, palm forward. And as she moves her arm outward from the shoulder, then we are, in essence, abducting, taking something away. So that's abduction. And then we can also go the other way and bring the arm closer, and that would be adduction. Adduction. Okay? Now if we can do flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, all in one joint, then we can also do this other thing called circumduction. And I will demonstrate it in my finger number 2 MP joint right here. This joint is capable of doing flexion, extension, right? These two movements, flexion, extension, and then it can also do moving this way and moving this way, which in relation to the hand, this would be abduction and this would be adduction. Okay? And so if I employ all 4 of those movements, then I create this cone-like movement right there. That's called circumduction. Okay, and that's what she's demonstrating here at the shoulder. The shoulder is capable of circumduction. And it's not a twisting. It's going from flexion to abduction, or in this case, abduction to flexion to adduction to extension. So we're going around in a cone-like formation that way. Okay, between C1 and C2, we have a pivot. There's a number of places where we pivot. One is here between C1 and C2. Okay, so we have this rotational type of movement, a pivot. Another place occurs at the head of the radius. The radius spins in the radial notch of the ulna, and so one could say at that particular joint we also have rotational movement. Now, since this is in the midline, the rotation is simply left or right. If we're off the midline, then we would say rotating laterally or medially. Okay? So, and then that's exactly what's going on here at the hip. If this person who cannot spin their knee in any way keeps it straight and then moves the foot this way, we have what's called a lateral rotation. Okay? And there are muscles of the hip that are actually called the lateral rotators of the hip. You might be familiar with the piriformis as one of them. Okay, then we move from the outward pointing toe to bringing the toe inward, and we have something called medial rotation. Okay, so the shoulder does this as well, not just the hip. These are both ball and socket joints. So the unique feature of a ball and socket joint is that it's capable of lateral and medial rotation as well as circumduction. Okay, so that's what's unique about ball and socket joints. Okay, so oftentimes we have, if we look at a tennis player, you can imagine that she could bring her arm out this way with a tennis racket and then bring it forward with a forehand, and that would involve some level of medial rotation across the shoulder joint right there. Okay. A backhand, of course, would be the other rotation. Here's something that I want you to pay close attention to because it involves something very special that normally I demonstrate in person a great deal, and I'm unable to do it at this moment. So you'll just have to take my word for it, and maybe I'll look down a little bit at my own body here with the camera, but in fact I'll do that right now. I'll look down, and what I would like you to notice, and you can do this with your own arm, is that if you look down and hold your hand down this way with the palm forward, you'll notice that your elbow is creating an angle that is away from your hip. If you do this, you'll notice that pronation right there brings your hand closer to the hip. If you do this, it goes away from the hip. Do you see that? If you were holding a bucket handle right there, you could carry a bucket and it would not interfere with your gait. All right, so sometimes we call this position right here, which is the supine position, as having a carry angle, and that you close the angle when you do this. When you pronate, you close the angle. So let's take a look at the picture here. And here we have a left hand, so you can imagine that there's a hip right here. Okay, and the left hand is sort of pointing away from the hip. And then as we cross the two bones, you can see that the radius is rotating across the ulna. Isn't that nice? Okay, if she was holding a writing device in this part of her hand and she was planting her little finger, she could make this move and create an arc with her writing device, and hence the radius would have created a radius. Okay, so now the point here that I'm making is that this is a strong position, right? That if you're in the supine position, someone asks you to pass the salt, please, right? And you can push something with your hand this way. Do you see that I'm supine and I can actually push something lightly with my fingers that's not of great weight or mass? But if I needed to do something with great strength, then I would actually not do this. If I had to push a car, I would immediately turn my hand over in the prone position, grab the bumper, and start pushing this way. So do you see that this is a much stronger position because the force is now direct and continuous through the upper and lower arm. It's an important detail. Okay, and I'll come back to it at some point.